Alright guys, today we're going to talk about CQB, focusing on something that I think is overlooked by most people, and might even seem trivial at first glance, but when you begin to really understand it, you realize how important it is to unlocking that next level CQB coordination between you and your friends. Today we're going to have an introductory discussion about doors, how they open, its impact on teamwork, and how they mesh with the flow of the stack as a whole. And I know this might sound like a really stupid thing to get hung up on, but it's one of those things that doesn't strike you as a legitimate problem until you actually try doing CQB, and then you realize, hold on, when the door opens a certain way, it'll totally obscure the sight lines of the stack. And depending on how the door opens, there are pros and cons to which side of the door you stand on. And all of this is really important for those small micro engagements you find in CQB. But before I go any further explaining stuff, I do want to say that for anything that I'm about to say to apply, you need a group of friends to be able to do this stuff with, because unfortunately, AI hasn't developed to the point where you can play CQB solo. And that's why this video is proudly sponsored by Milsim Units, which is a project that will help you solve this problem. Milsim Units is a dedicated platform to help you find a group of friends or recruit to start one yourself, achieving that peak CQB flow with the boys we all strive for. The website displays a ranked list of the most active groups through a daily voting system, as well as a rundown of their basic information, so you know you're not wasting time with the unit that's dead or not a good fit for you. If you want to start your own group, creating a profile on Milsim Units helps you to attract more and better recruits by boosting your visibility using subscription tiers. Milsim Units even has its own podcast where you can check out in-depth conversations with unit leaders, exploring their unit's culture and operations to learn more about those groups that you can join through Milsim Units. So if you want to join a group where you can actually try to achieve high levels of CQB coordination, don't hesitate, make it a reality with Milsim Units today. Now bear with me while I just quickly establish the fundamentals of how doors work. I know you know how doors work. I won't insult your intelligence by assuming otherwise, but we need to talk about it. When you're in a CQB situation and you come across a single door, not a double door, you will always be in one of four situations. You are either at the hinge side of a push door, the hinge side of a pull door, the handle side of a push door, or the handle side of a pull door. So assuming that you're solo, we're just going to walk through each of these scenarios real quick and see what happens. So if we're at the hinge side of a push door, you can see that when you open the door, you'll have a clear line of sight into the room, and positioning yourself like this is called attacking the crack, because you are literally attacking the crack of light as the door opens. And from this position, whether you choose to dynamically dig your corner or do a slow pie or do a fast pan to center, hybrid, dynamic, deliberate, whatever, that doesn't matter, because until that point, you have put yourself in a good position as far as opening the door goes, and that's all we care about in this video. However, let's see what happens when you're on the hinge side of a pull door. You're ready to go, you open it, and the door opens right into your face. And in terms of situational awareness, you are now worse off than before you open the door. You have lost the element of surprise, and also this door is not bulletproof, and there is the risk that an enemy will shoot you through the door. Now, let's look at what happens when you're on the handle side of a push door. It's not as bad as being on the hinge side of a pull door, but there is still the risk that the door, when it opens, will obscure your sight lines into the room, which you can't fix without then exposing yourself in the threshold. So being on the handle side of a push door isn't ideal. Now notice here that I am dealing with a game limitation where the door here can only open to the 90 degrees, but even IRL, where the door can swing all the way back to the wall, there is always that risk that there is an object behind the door that will block it from opening enough to give you good sight lines into the room. And in either case, you wouldn't want to give up first look into the room to start gaining angles even as the door is opening. So that is something that you need to be always cognizant of. And finally, we have the handle side of a pull door, and you can see that similar to being on the hinge side of a push door, this gives you ideal angles to attack the crack before you commence with your entry and clearance. So we can conclude that when you're in a CQB situation and there are no external factors at play, you want to ideally position yourself either at the hinge side of a push door or the handle side of a pull door to attack the crack. But in order to do that, you need to be able to assess whether a door is a push door or a pull door to begin with. And if you're like me, you can barely do this in real life. How do you do this in a video game? Well, as long as the game is made properly, It's easy. In order to work properly, every door needs to have hinges, and these hinges will always be on the side of the door that it opens towards. So a rule of thumb to follow is if you can see the hinges on your side of the door is a pull door. If you cannot see the hinges, it is highly likely to be a push door. Of course, this is just a rule of thumb and not always the case. Now, unfortunately, as I've been mentioning, in Milsim gaming, we face the additional challenge of not all games having consistent door logic, and this is a fact that just drives me nuts. And it's where the quality of the game and the game developers comes into play. You can have this knowledge and try to use it, but if a game has doors that just open in illogical random directions, regardless of where the hinges are visibly located, or if they just don't have hinges at all, then there's no point. So this is where I reiterate that this video only applies to games that have this feature, such as Arma 3 with the correct mods, and I plead with tactical shooter developers to please pay attention to the doors. But I digress. Let's move on and talk about how this simple observation that we've made about attacking the crack impacts teamwork. Now we're going to assume that you have a buddy with you and do the same exercise as before, but this time we're going to discuss isolated door problems to establish foundational principles for where the number 1 man and number 2 man should stand for a 2-man stack and who should be opening the door. So the first point is that when discussing a single door in a vacuum, it's generally advantageous to establish a split stack where you have one guy on either side of the door, and that's the assumption that we're going to have for this section of the video. Having a split stack ensures that you will always have someone ready to attack the crack on the strong side of the door and another man ready to open the door on the support side of the door. And the support side man will always be claiming the role of breacher. The breacher is the one who opens the entryway by calling my door so that everyone else knows the role is taken care of. When you have a 2-man element split stack on a push door, things are super simple. The hinge side attacks the crack while the handle side breaches. For a pull door, it's a little bit more complicated. Let me explain. The handle side is the strong side attacking the crack, but that man is also next to the handle and is thus better positioned to swing the door. So IRL, different groups will have different SOPs to standardize actions. Some will still have the hinge side of a pull door open the door, which allows the handle side to keep their gun up and ready, which in close proximities like in CQB, those milliseconds to be ready to shoot can make the difference. Now, other groups will just have the handle side man self-breach to prevent anyone from exposing themselves in the threshold. So there are different pros and cons here. In my opinion, it's not really that important for video game SOPs. It's more important to standardize in one way or another. But of course, keep in mind, in practice, it's really just the man who calls my door who now has responsibility for breaching. You shouldn't be having an argument over your SOPs during a live run. You want to save that for the AAR and when you're practicing. And when you're practicing, of course, do it right. Okay, so we've covered the rules of the ideal for when you're opening the door alone and when you're opening the door with a buddy. So now we're going to take these principles and see how they fit in more realistic situations using a 6-man stack as an example. So let's start with a single stack scenario. A single stack refers to when everybody in the stack is on one side of the door. And generally speaking, in a single stack, the number 1 man self-breaches, where he opens his own door. I have seen examples IRL of the number 2 man reaching forward to open the door for number 1 man, but it's not really a universal thing, and more importantly, it's not practical for video games, so we're going to disregard this practice in this video. So, as you can tell, for a single stack, all the different cases you run into for breaching the door are identical to the very first examples we ran through as a solo man. Your 2 ideal situations are being on the hinge side of a push door or the handle side of a pull door. However, there will be times when you find yourself on the handle side of a push door, for example, especially if the room is a corner-fed room at the end of a hallway. What do you do in this scenario? According to our principles, you're supposed to attack the crack. So, do you try to move to the other side of the door? Well, it may not be possible because there may not be any space, but even if there is space, there are other principles to keep in mind. For example, in CQB, we also never want to turn our back to the unknown or a potential threat. So in this case, even if the hallway continued on the other side of the door, you don't want to go to the other side to turn your back to any potential threats further down the hallway. So in this case, you choose to stay on this side of the door with the number 2 man behind you responsible for holding security down the hall. However, there are situations where a single stack like this isn't ideal, so we're going to talk about split stacking. So for example, if you're the number 1 man stack, there might be an external factor at play, like you might see uncleared dead space further down the hall as you approach the threshold, which you then assess as being the bigger threat than a closed door. And this is where things like priorities of threat come into play. Topic for another video. The point is, in this case, the number 1 man might choose to bump the door, crossing to the other side to maintain long security on the uncleared dead space. The number 2 man would then take over security on the door and roll it, following the number 1 man so that they are back to back. The rest of the stack would then establish itself on the original side of the door from whence they came. And bada boom, you now have a split stack on this door, and from here you are positioned to follow the same logic for opening the door as we went over in the 2-man stack examples. So as you can see here, just from going over the very basic scenarios and the different situations you would run into as either a solo man or a 2-man team for opening a door, you are then equipped with the foundational knowledge you need to know how a full stack should handle different situations as it relates to the door. Again, this video is just being very narrow in scope, focusing on opening doors. Even the smallest, most basic things can have massive ripple effects. So I highly encourage you guys to start practicing this stuff. Start paying attention to door hinges and handles and work through how to best set up for the doorway breach, given the full context of your situation, before you even start thinking about entering and clearing the room and using dynamic versus deliberate clearance techniques or whatever. Of course, assuming that you're playing the right video game to be able to use this. So guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Please leave a comment down below, give me a like and subscribe while you're at it. I'd also appreciate it if you could buy me a coffee using the link in the description, as I do go through a lot of caffeine while making these videos. Your support and love is much appreciated. Guys, I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.